Please listen carefully.
Well, hello, universe, and welcome to the Optimist Daily Update. I'm Christy Jansen.
And I'm Summers McKay.
And we are part of the team behind the Optimist Daily, making solutions the news. We bring you reader-funded solutions news every day in order to change the tenor of news media, social media, and help make the direction of your day be one focused on solutions.
7 days a week, we publish positive news stories written by award-winning journalists and delivered online to your inbox and through our social channels. And also, we are sharing these solutions in a commute-worthy, walk-worthy, home office-worthy, scrolling through the new OptimistDaily.com worthy podcast. Today is Wednesday, the 22nd of September, 2021. Hi, Christy. How are you?
Good morning, Summers. I am great. I'm excited about our podcast for today. And I know we have to not just jump into that, but I'm really looking forward to what's coming up.
I mean, we can just jump into it, but before we do that, just for a brief and fleeting moment, I just want to celebrate everyone on the team at the Optimist Daily. I want to thank all of our programmers, our tech team, our designers, our architects, our writers, everyone for ushering in a new fabulous chapter on OptimistDaily.com. It looks really good, Christy, doesn't it?
I know. I was so happy when it launched. The new site launched yesterday, right?
Yep. So we are entering fall with a new site this last quarter of 2021, and we're really, really excited. So if you haven't checked it out yet, everybody head over to OptimistDaily.com, check it out, sign up for a free subscription. Welcome to optimism, and welcome to education and information and learning, right?
Yes,
science, communication in particular.
Yes. Today we have a special podcast with a science communicator who's going to talk with us about her work in trying to make science make sense. We make the solutions the news. Nini Munoz, who's our guest today, her mission is to have science make sense to all of us, I think.
Quick personal background. Nini and I met when I first moved to the Santa Barbara area. We were both part of a group called Santa Barbara Entrepreneurs, trying to kind of navigate about, almost 10 years ago, 8 to 10 years ago, just sort of figuring out what our chapter was as, entrepreneurial women with goals of making a difference in this world with a lot of do good, do well mindset. Nini has a really interesting academic and personal history. She's originally from Barranquilla, Colombia, obtained her PhD in electrical engineering from Cornell in 2014, and completed her BS from Cornell as well. She works in fabrication and design at Garmin International in Goleta, and she has this pretty badass Instagram.
It's amazing.
Nini in the Brain.
Nini in the Brain, and we'll put the links to that in the show notes. But she's just this really interesting, fantastic person that Summers knew, and we were talking about what's going on in the world right now and the need for good. I mean, there's good science going on, but there's a lot of times there's the gap between good science and good science communication. And I recently read an article by Apurva Mandavili in the New York Times talking about how this pandemic has given Americans basically a crash course on scientific uncertainty. And we've all been watching that happen. It's not just around medical information, but if you look at information about the changing climate and just how science works, I think there's a gap between good scientific literacy that needs to be addressed, and Nini is working on that. So should we welcome you, Nini, onto the pod?
I think we should. I think we should stop talking about her and start talking to her.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It has been an interesting 18 months. I actually have quite the background teaching very complex subjects in the classroom. But I also have a lot of experience doing what we call risk analysis in my professional, my everyday work. And so a lot of what I'm doing is kind of like the culmination of, like the combination of both of those different endeavors, because what we are really seeing is, as you mentioned, is trying to effectively communicate science in the face of uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty because this is a novel virus. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is something we've never seen before. And because of that, there are a lot of moving parts in science. In a way, there's kind of a bit of a moving target. And so as the science changes, public health guidelines change in response to that. And most of the public isn't accustomed to that. Usually they're used to getting a hand delivered product and guidance here.
To paint the picture for folks who are listening, if you are on Instagram, it's Nini and the Brain. But what Nini has taken on and embarked with her Instagram in the last 18 months has been using infographics and simplified information to deliver really, really complex subjects. So as a educator, you are using the Instagram platform to educate in really just unprecedented ways. What made you turn to Instagram to just get started?
Well, honestly, remember when everything kind of closed down, right? It was like mid-March of last year.
March 6th, 2020. And,
I got an appendectomy that day, March 16th.
Oh my,
wait, welcome to the club.
I did too. I got mine on the 20th of May.
Yeah, so last year. Mine was March 16th. And
March 16th, okay. Mine was a few months later, actually.
And I literally, the reason why I booked it was because I knew this was coming. And I think that was the very first day they admitted the first person to the hospital. So I was in and out of that hospital that day. And that evening, I read the news that the first person had been hospitalized. So here I was recovering from surgery. Yeah. And you can imagine, most of my friends from back home, from Colombia, they know that I understand complex subjects. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an infectious disease researcher, but I understand science. And so a lot of my friends were asking me questions. And so I actually just started, reading the papers and listening to the different public health guidances. And there was great presentations from, even like the Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. So I was kind of listening to all of that and communicating that to, my friends and family. And soon thereafter, I just realized that there was so much information coming out every day. And so much of it was really poorly communicated that it was causing these waves of fear and panic. And this is something that I've talked about before. And this is why, my Instagram handle, there's a little story behind that. So what happens is that in your brain, you have the different ways of processing information, right? So you have, what we call the top-down system, which is you process information first and then respond with an emotion to that. And then there's the bottom-up system, which is you just elicit an emotional response without processing the information. And a lot of what is happening, those clickbait headlines, what they're doing is they're triggering emotional responses. And that in turn kind of disables your ability to cognitively process the information first. So a lot of these, fear-inducing headlines make people less receptive to information. That's a lot of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. It's like the lizard brain just turns on and then the complex cortex kind of shuts down.
Exactly. And so I recognized that really early on, even just between, my interactions with a lot of my friends who would text me every day and they're like, oh my goodness, this came out. And then this came out, every day there was a headline. And so, a lot of the motivation that I had was to really work on that because, I recognize that, I'm a person who in the past has struggled with health anxiety. So I could kind of relate to what a lot of people were experiencing as well. But I also knew, I knew how to teach. So I was like, okay, let me give this a shot. So I started to, put together these little videos. I was doing a lot of videos at first, but those were really time intensive. And so I started to learn more and just communicate what I could. A lot of it was from, more of a risk analyst perspective. And then I started to get more into the science and the complex jargon. And for that, I started to collaborate with people that had more expertise because it's something that I continuously encourage people to do, to ask questions and to, in this unprecedented time in history, I tell people if you can emerge out of this pandemic saying, wow, I know less than I thought I knew, that's a step in the right direction.
Right. I love that.
It's coming up. It's going to be a post where I'm going to talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? It really is a step in the right direction, like being humble and understanding and just being cognizant of the fact that, hey, I don't know everything, and that's totally okay. I was just telling a close friend of mine how much more comfort I have today than I did 2 years ago in saying, you know what? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, because that is what ignites our curiosity in understanding, but also in just reaching out to other people to learn more about a specific subject.
Nina, you know what's so interesting about that statement, which I find really, really insightful, is I remember when, like, if I was as confident now as I was when I was 16 about what I knew I knew, like I thought I understood everything when I was like a 16-year-old. I was so sure of myself in so many ways. And I am so unsure of my knowledge about so many different subjects now that I'm, past 50.
With increasing maturity comes increasing uncertainty and acceptance of said uncertainty.
And it's okay to not know.
Right.
Absolutely. But on the same token, our brains hate not knowing. and this is something that I discuss quite a bit. If you take a look at, the history of public health responses in modern medicine over the last 150 years, it's been unprecedented. I think that if I ever think about something that sends like positive chills down my spine, it's, humans' capacity of solving these complex problems, especially in regards to health, especially because if you look at public health responses and, sanitation and, the introduction of like immunization schedules in modern medicine, it's really been in the last 100 years where we've made so much progress to the point that we've extended life expectancy by close to 3 decades. That's huge. That's huge. I tell people in 1900, less than 4% of the population in the US grew to be 65 years and older, compared to almost 17% today. Yeah. You just take a look at those numbers. And so, of course, a lot of what has happened is that, the burden of disease has really shifted to chronic disease, in a population that's getting older. And that's a good thing. But we're not used to that. Right. We're not, and so it creates a lot of uncertainty. And when you think about it, 100 years is not a very long time to find out what causes, dementia, right? In 1900s, Alzheimer's wasn't even an ICD code as it is today. And so I think that, while, we get overwhelmed with the idea, like with the uncertainty, especially in regards to, health anxiety, because there's all these now known chronic conditions that can develop later on in life. At the same time, it's actually an assessment of how well we are doing, and people forget that. And I always kind of re-emphasize that. Like, this is where we were, and this is where we are now. And we've got to be able to sit with some of that, uncertainty, even though it's uncomfortable, because in a way it's a good thing.
Christy, do you want to dive into, now I know we've been talking about that people are sort of looking for a checkmate in science communication, right? Everybody wants conclusions. And Christy, you had some really good sort of insight and research that you were doing into understanding that science is perpetually evolving. Do you want to weigh in on or talk about that, and then we'll get Nini's reaction?
Sure. I think one of the things that's so interesting about this particular moment and the focus that we've all had on science and how it works, and also how it's different now because I feel like it's sped up in a way. This is always how science works, where there's always kind of something comes up and you make a hypothesis, then you test it, and then it gets peer reviewed, and then it goes through this whole process. And usually that's happening in, conferences with just people who are working on that particular question around science. So a bunch of physicists get together, or a bunch of doctors get together, a bunch of psychologists get together, and everybody's doing their own little research, and then they peer review, they iterate, they make their hypothesis, they either prove it right or wrong, and then they write a paper which gets published or not. And now with what's happened with this novel coronavirus, which you actually are speaking more correctly on this than I. We need the information more quickly because we have lives to save and lives to worry about. And so we're taking action before we really have a full understanding of what the outcomes might be. And so, as you were saying, that just makes us go, but you told me last week that I shouldn't wear a mask, and now I should wear a mask. And wait, last week you told me that I needed to do this, and now I can do this. It's so confusing, and then there's this mistrust that gets sort of incubated and then pushed out. And I think what you're working on is I appreciate it, especially in this particular moment. But I feel like the whole way that we communicate, also with social media, how there's like everything is instantaneous. We don't even wait for the newspaper anymore. We get it on our Twitter feeds. And I think you made a comment somewhere like the science doesn't actually happen on Twitter. And
I did. I wrote that
in your feed. But I maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that and how science has been done for the last 400 years since they invented the scientific method. Right?
As you mentioned, you hit upon it. Like the scientific method, I mean, that's still a process, right? Where you have a hypothesis and you gather data. What happens in social media is the communication aspect of it, right? Mm-hmm. But you're not conducting science per se on the social media platforms. You're communicating it. And unfortunately, what we see happening is that there's figures of authority that sometimes use their platforms to make statements without valid data sets or with unreliable data sets. And that is, that's one of the issues that we see. I think these platforms are extremely powerful to communicate science, and they're extremely powerful to have a dialogue about the risks versus benefits. Because at the end of the day, especially with what we're seeing now, science is to improve people's lives. Mm-hmm. And that warrants a further discussion about risks versus benefits and within the context of public health guidance. So those are important discussions to have. Like, perfect example. We saw an increased incidence of myocarditis in the young male population with one of like the vaccines that are currently being administered. So then you have a discussion about the risk versus benefits within that population. But mm-hmm. the science is the science. Like the science, the statistical studies show, okay, there's an increased incidence of this.
I love what you do on Nini and the Brain is simply communicate the data without the slant, right? And there was one that you did almost a year ago, I think, or maybe more than a year ago, about blood type and infection rates. And the fact is, the data is, as you clearly stated, yes, the data is that people, and this was a year ago, I don't know how the Delta variant plays into this, but like a year ago, people with type O blood have a slightly less likelihood of contracting COVID. However, it is so slight that we can't then have an agenda based around it, right? Absolutely. So you broke down what is the fact. And actually, Christy, you read a headline yesterday in our team meeting, which was like how we read facts, right? And I'm not even going to repeat that headline because it was so slanted, but it was just a fact. A fact is that people with type O blood are slightly less likely to contract COVID. This was the fact with the data in July, right, of 2020, right? So a long time ago. I don't know what data has been updated since. And then you explained how that fact didn't become agenda focused. You said, okay, great, that's true, this is data, but still, and all of these other factors contribute at a higher level of reducing your likelihood of contracting the disease.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think that you've done a really good job of removing agenda. Has there been a challenge for you has there been any one post for you that has been really like that skyrocketed the communication? I mean, you and I went from being just like super cool friends on Instagram to now I'm like, I got to talk to your publicist to call you because you got 75,000 followers, right? So
no, you can still call me. I'm still pretty available.
But what was the hockey stick moment, or was it cumulative? And how did this sort of turn for you where all of a sudden you had this emotional moment to realize, was it like the hot bikini picture after the COVID data? Like what happened in your personal journey to know that this work was working?
The ripple effect. I think knowing that the work that I'm doing, it's not just reaching my audience. It's reaching their family members and their communities. So really early on, one of the earlier posts I did maybe back in, I want to say November or December, where I talked about the physics behind masks, right?
Mm-hmm.
How the mask works. And I remember that I received a message from somebody saying, I am in rural Indiana and I used your set of slides to convince my whole community to wear a mask, like on Nextdoor.
Yeah, on Nextdoor.
Right?
I love it.
And so it's always been about the ripple effect. There's a saying, I always say this. I say to people, me personally, I am the happiest when I'm not thinking about myself. I mean, that's just me. Like, I am just the happiest when I'm not thinking about myself. And I think this work allows me to do that. Obviously you got to take care of yourself. People ask me if I sleep. No. I actually do. I sleep a lot, but I really, it's very rewarding because it's doing a couple of things. Not only is it, improving scientific literacy, it's helping calm those fear elicited responses from clickbait headlines. It's providing, accurate scientific information, but it's also hopefully saving someone's life. And that to me is extremely rewarding. And it's not just with COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, this extends far and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic because misinformation just has huge consequences throughout communities.
I think that's so important to acknowledge. I mean, for me, I first started thinking about effective science communication more around climate change, for example, which is clearly, despite the fact that there's been overwhelming consensus in the science community that human activity and how we exploit our natural environment has been the main driver of dangerous environmental changes that are going on. There's so much sort of uncertainty and doubt which has been communicated that there's more confusion, or there has been until recently, and distrust that there hasn't really been, even though there's tons of information out there, there's been very little action.
Correct.
So far.
Yeah. And here's, and you guys brought up something really important, and I want to kind of come back to that, and that is uncertainty. With climate change, if you think about it, like what could be the worst consequence of not taking action? That's huge, right? Like we already know what the implications are. And so one of the things that I really try to emphasize, because part of my professional, line of work, I do a lot of risk analysis, and so one of the things that you have to account for, because as we've discussed, science can be uncertain, especially when it's happening so quickly. There's a lot of moving parts. Somebody kind of described it once as many people building a puzzle, and everybody's working on a different part of a puzzle. There was a great tweet about this, and then you're trying to kind of bring those pieces together, and you're finding, oh, this part may fit. This other part may not fit. Let's go back and look at this other piece. And that's kind of like what's happening. It's like a patchwork approach of the scientific community, and everybody's, of course, seeing it in real time. But what people are not used to is the uncertainty. And I think they forget that a lot of the guidance that is given is in response to what science may not know, but taking into account what could be the worst outcome of not acting. Right. And it's so critical. I mean, all of our products are built like that. Even, I currently work for Garmin, and in aviation, we've got to take into account that one of the sensors might not work. So what do? We add two. That's, we have to account for uncertainty, and people just don't realize how it's built in. Like, I'll give you a perfect example, like your food ingredients, and, certain ingredients that can be, people talk about toxic, it's toxic. It's a very, you should never talk about toxic ingredients without talking about the dose, right? Because even water can be toxic if you drink too much of it.
Sure. Right.
Right. And so a perfect example. So that the threshold for what's considered toxic are set like 10,000 levels below the actual toxicity level. And the reason they do that is to account for the uncertainty. Maybe a manufacturing uncertainty. Maybe you eat a whole bunch of it, more than the recommended amount. And it's built into, regulatory processes, but people are not used to seeing it in real time.
Right. And somebody who weighs 30 pounds is going to have a different toxicity response than somebody who weighs 300 pounds. And so you don't know what size the person is too. You have to take that.
It's just built in, but right now we're doing it, as every day. And so like with the mask guidance, right? Uncertainty about, transmission. There was uncertainty at the beginning about whether asymptomatic people could spread. So all of that just really guides the public health guidance. So for instance, with COVID-19, we know that it's driven by super spreaders, which is really fascinating. So 10 to 20% of people infected drive like 80% of the new infections, which is a staggering statistic. But we don't know who those people are.
Or necessarily why those people are.
Exactly.
Right? So we in a school that I know that maybe a child I know goes to, they've had 2 years with never having a repeat infection in a classroom, right? If one of the kids got it, nobody else got it. If one of the teachers got it, nobody else got it. They've never had an incident where because they shut down the classroom immediately, everyone goes home, you're home for 5 days. It's a bit arduous on the parents, but we've all agreed like this works. And we just had our first situation where there was like a reinfection and a number of people in a given classroom all came down with it. And it was this moment of what changed? What's the quote unquote super spreader experience? And that uncertainty has everyone not sure what our next move is, right? And you had a post, I think 2-3 weeks ago, maybe, about the value of rapid testing. And I know that you had created that conversation. And I know, Christy, we promised ourselves this was going to be a science communication conversation, not just a COVID one. But that was a solution, Nini, that you put forth, was that in the face of this uncertainty, ubiquitous rapid testing in education environments, public environments, is going to help us get more answers.
Yeah. And
as to the how and why.
Absolutely. Yeah. And specifically, so that's a perfect example. We have several types of tests. The gold standard has been PCR. Mm-hmm. That's what they've been using for the last 18 months, which is a stupendous test. It's got great specificity. So if you get a positive PCR, it's very likely that you are indeed infected. But the turnaround is 48 hours or more. Mm-hmm. And so one way of thinking about that is that while you wait for your results, you have a test that is 0% sensitive. That's one way of thinking about it. Uh-huh. Whereas your antigen test, your rapid test, it takes 15 minutes. It may be less sensitive, so it may not capture all the people that are infected. Mm-hmm. But it's got two advantages. It's likely to capture people when they're contagious. So it's got a great sensitivity for when people are contagious, above 90%. And that's kind of like when you care, right? When somebody is contagious. But at the same time, because it is a 15-minute turnaround, you don't have that extended period of time where you have a test of 0% sensitivity. Mm-hmm. And so even though on paper it looks like, it's less sensitive, we might not capture all the cases, for a school where you don't want to have to quarantine children unless you need to, because that results in delayed educational attainment, which is another risk, right?
And also reduction of women in the workforce.
Absolutely.
Other side effect of it.
And plus whatever emotional and social challenges that those kids are going to have by not being in school, and it's just better to learn in person.
Absolutely. And that's something that I really, a lot of the posts that I've made look at this whole big picture, like a big, whole big picture risk analysis where
solutions aren't siloed.
Exactly. Yeah. I did a whole post talking about the economy and lives saved. And I kind of broke down the risks of both like letting, COVID go uncontrolled versus the risks of continuously like just being at home all the time. Because it's important. The solutions are somewhere in the middle, and we have to be able to leverage whatever platforms and technology we have to find a middle ground, especially now where we're learning more about how, and I'm going to be discussing this actually tomorrow about what the future holds with COVID-19 and how we will likely transition to being like an endemic, right? It's going to have an endemic course. And so it's important to have these realistic conversations, especially in a climate where, people can be more polarized for one thing or the other. So I always try to find like that middle ground. And I find that, doing risk analysis really helps because you can actually assign a value to a risk. And you're like, oh, okay, this is going to cost this much, but this is going to cost this much. So how do we balance those two? Yeah. So it's an interesting way of communicating. And I think it has resonated with a lot of people.
Oh, this is such a great conversation. I know, Christy, you probably have a couple more comments and then we'll have to let Nini go. But Christy, do you want to take us home?
Sure. I mean, yeah, we could probably talk for another 4 hours and maybe we should.
it would be like a 7-hour podcast.
Because I think, what you've really been honing your skills at, Nini, is communicating around the pandemic. And there's so much critical information that is always sort of changing, and as it evolves. Delta, I had people in my family had some breakthrough cases because of everybody's vaccinated, but the Delta variant really makes a huge difference. And I think that is something that maybe earlier in this pandemic we weren't as prepared for. And so that's another uncertainty, right? And how do we take that into account when we go forward? But there's other aspects of science which have critical impact on our lives and on how we are going to develop in the world that I think you're learning here, and science literacy you're building and then now starting to teach and show will have interesting effects, like, for example, in relation to climate change or in relation to other health issues that come up. And navigating the facts and the feelings, and how do we as like just regular people react? So I think I just really appreciate what you're working on here. Do you have have you been working with any scientists or public health groups to help them hone their communication skills? Because I feel like there's this big gap in there. It's like so many people in public health or in other science backgrounds are very hesitant to talk because they don't want to create fear, or they're hesitant to create action.
Yeah, a lot of the mentoring that I do really has been on social media platforms. So, newer science communicators. One of the things that I really like to do is collaborate with science communicators, regardless of the size of their platforms, to help them, elevate their messaging. But one of the things that I really do, mainly on Instagram, because I'm most active in that platform, is just mentoring some of the science communicators with tone and language and way of presenting data, because it's a bit of an art, presenting data in a way that's not going to elicit a fear response, or it's not going to make people just feel more concerned or worried when they shouldn't. Because at the end of the day, science is science. Science is going to be evolving. Like, I have a lot of faith in the scientific process, the scientific community. If you just take a look at even just some of chronic conditions in the last 30 years and the progress that's been made, it's really outstanding. And so I have a lot of faith in that. And I think part of what we want to do as science communicators is not just communicate the science, but also leverage a positive tone to it in the face of uncertainty. I think it's so important because there's just, as I say, it's like a brave new world for all of us. It's just changing. Even, for our generation and maybe just a couple of generations behind us, it's a world that wasn't there like a couple hundred years back. And science can only work so quickly. We're seeing it now, right? And people are like, well, why is it changing all the time? It's like, yeah, because usually, when you get your medicine, or your packaged vaccines that you're willing to be receptive to, it's already been like 10 years, right? Since we figured all these things out.
If not 50 years, for some of the vaccines. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think science has always been hesitant to to be activists. Scientists are not typically activists, right?
Most scientists are very introverted. That's
very not interested. So, and now with all these new media technologies like social media and sort of that instant the demand for information, I think people who have the knowledge and have the expertise are often hesitant to weigh in, where people who maybe have more confidence but less knowledge are less hesitant to weigh in, so it's interesting for you in this new media sphere of Instagram, how you're helping to bridge that divide and maybe even teach some more effective communication strategies and skills and guide that conversation. And I think that's so essential.
And I'm learning as I go, I'm still learning as I go. I think especially, around medical and health misinformation, I think one has to be even a little bit more nuanced and receptive to people's sensitivities, because that strikes a chord for a lot of people. So,
and it's interesting. So we have to, I know, wind this up, Summers, I know, but there's two last things. One is, so I just recently was given this book by Faith Kearns called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, and she's comes out of the communicating around climate. And I'll share this with you, Nini, because I think you might find it interesting. And it's more targeted. Her audience is going to be the science communicators themselves and even the scientists around that. But she talks about the need to develop your skills in relating, in listening, in being okay with conflict and knowing how to address it, and then also understanding trauma. And I think those things are all so important when you're dealing with different populations. And you're listening to the people who are asking you the questions and not just telling them the information. And it becomes a conversation as opposed to, I know, I am the expert and I know. And I think that that's part of the reaction that some communities who are like, they've been mistreated for decades.
Absolutely. And, and it's one of the things that, that I have some of my posts reviewed by whenever I have a post that is for a specific community, I actually ask people in that community to review it for me. Like, I will ask them, hey, is the tone of this okay? Like, there's this whole post that I did on the fear contagion, and the overall feedback I received from people that it was extremely compassionate, because I wasn't trying to shame people about having anxiety, because it's totally normal. But it's something that I've become more and more receptive to. And to be honest with you, I probably wasn't too receptive to it like 2 years ago. And over time I have.
I love this conversation, ladies. And I love the idea that our compassion, just like science evolves, our compassion and understanding for one another evolve. And that is where we're going to head in a direction of making this world better, so we can come back together in some newer version of the future. Christy, as always, this has been a super fabulous conversation. We left no available time to discuss headlines for OptimistDaily.com, so everyone's just going to have to head over and look at them themselves.
Yeah.
Promise they're super good.
Yeah. We need to have Nini tell us her final question.
That's right.
We always ask our guests, Nini, at the end of our conversation. So what is something that is making you optimistic about the science communication or about anything in your life? How can you connect with our audience at the Optimist Daily?
I'm very optimistic about people's renewed passion for science. I think that when something directly impinges onto somebody's life or livelihood, it awakens an interest. I mean, that just happens across the board. And I really love to see people's renewed interest in science and curiosity, and also how the scientific community has become more receptive of, people's humanity. And I think that's just so critical for scientists to be able to tap into their own, compassion and humility and insecurities to connect with the broader audience that's going to ultimately benefit from science. And I think that's something that in a way has been lacking. Even with, as I said, technology just whoosh, it just grew so quickly at an unprecedented level that I think part of the scientific community didn't even foresee the potential implications. And I think it is really critical that, whether you're a scientist or an engineer or a product designer, we sit with our ideas and understand what they mean in the bigger scheme of things and how people adopt them. And I think this really has renewed that conversation. There's a great quote by Asimov, and I recently,
I was just looking at that on your feed.
Yeah, the saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. And maybe it doesn't have to be a sad thing. Maybe it's something that, I really think that one of the silver linings of, this pandemic is understanding of that and realization of that and change to make sure that gap between science and communities is narrowed further.
Nini, thank you so much. Christy, thank you. Everyone, I'm going to send you off on that today. Thank you guys for listening to the Optimist Daily Update. Nini, thank you for joining us for the conversation. As always, at the Optimist Daily, we promise to cover the current events with accuracy, legitimate sources, and offer you the information needed most to chart new paths for all of us. We are reader-funded, reader-supported, independent journalists at the Optimist Daily, and our brand spanking new beautiful website came due to the courtesy of our extraordinary emissary readers and funders who support the Optimist Daily. If you are not yet an emissary, please join for as little as $5 a month and come help us keep the Optimist Daily free for all who need it, supported by those who can. Everybody, have a great day and check the show notes for Nini and the Brain. Nini, we'll see you on Instagram.
Bye, guys.